welcome to everyone who's joining in for this first Author in Conversation event in the Medical Humanities Colloquy that we have been doing for the second semester on the trot now. In fact, this is the sixth talk in the series of Medical Humanities Colloquy. And this is the first one where we have a creative writer talking about his own book. So a first of its kind that way, if we think about an Author in Conversation event. Let me just briefly introduce the series for anyone who might be coming in for the first time or anyone who might be listening to this later on. The motivation behind having this colloquy in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department in IIT Gandhinagar is to open up dialogues between medicine, humanities, literary and cultural studies by dwelling on their intersections that operate in the cultural field of medicine. And the series encourages discussions on trauma, suffering, loss, grief, recovery, coping mechanisms, transformed identities, and so on. The presentations will cover and have covered, in fact, various subdisciplines within medical humanities, such as medical theater, medical sociology, clinical anthropology, psychoanalysis, and medical literature. The talks conducted by the respective field experts and leaders will encounter and have encountered and accentuated the granular details of clinical communication, clinical care spaces, familial care, written and oral narratives of the patients, etc., that seldom get highlighted in the data-oriented clinical case studies. So that's a very brief overview of the idea that governs the seminar series. And we have Sam Thompson today, and we have Swati Joshi, who's one of the organizers of this seminar series, and she will be in conversation with Sam Thompson. So I'll now give it over to Swati to conduct the rest of the conversation and, of course, introduce Sam. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. So Sam Thompson is the author of the novel Communion Town, Jott and Wolfstongue. His work has been longlisted for the Booker Prize and shortlisted for the Encore Prize. His short fiction has appeared in the anthologies, The Black Dreams, Out of the Darkness, Best British Short Stories 2019, and Still Worlds Turning, and on BBC Race. He grew up in the south of England, now lives in Belfast, where he teaches writing at Queen's University. Welcome, Sam. We're really glad to have you here.
Hi there. Thank you very much for having me. It's really great to speak to you, and thanks everyone for coming.
So I guess if you're comfortable, we could have reading of a couple of passages, and then we could just get into conversation.
Great. Yeah. No. It's Wolfstongue, this book that we are I think primarily going to speak about. So perhaps I'll just read a couple of pages from the beginning of the book just to give a kind of flavour of it. And then, yes, we can just have a conversation and get into some ideas that are hopefully interesting about it. This is a I can't remember if we said this. This is a novel for children. It's I suppose it's aimed, I suppose, at readers probably 8 to 11 years old, I would say. Writing it. One thing that made it an interesting experience to me writing this book was that I hadn't written for children before. I have always, and I continue to write fiction for adult readers as well. But for various reasons, which might be interesting to talk about, I have small children, and this was a story that I started to write really for my own kids, and then felt that there was the story to be developed into a novel from it. It's one thing I found writing for children is that it doesn't, I think, in all the ways that really matter, it doesn't seem particularly different to me from writing for adults, actually. That that the kind of the demands of the writing are, in some ways, I think writing for children is more rigorous. That you have to have a kind of an extra layer of awareness of audience and of the kind of registers of language you're using, but certainly you have to apply all the same kind of disciplines that you would writing for adults. So anyway, that as a preamble, that's Wolfstongue. I will read just the first few pages of the first chapter here, which I hope is self-explanatory. I should say also. I mean, the protagonist of this book is a 12-year-old boy, and I suppose the theme that it begins with, or the idea that it begins with, that this Silas, the protagonist, has difficulties with his speech. He has he has trouble finding the words that he needs and getting them out, and this is making him unhappy. It's causing him to be bullied at school, and that's the problem that he starts with. And as the book begins, he encounters a wolf, incongruously in his ordinary world, but this is a wolf who also has problems with language that will become apparent. So, chapter 1. There was a wolf on the cycle path. Silas walked along the path every day after school. It ran beside a patch of woodland. It was not the fastest way home, but Silas used it because he liked being by himself, and the cycle path was always empty. Until today. The wolf stood in the middle of the path, watching him. Its head was as high as his chest. He had never been so close to such a large wild animal. He did not know what to do. He had seen wolves in a wildlife park once. They had been pale, silent shapes, slipping between the trees, too far away to seem dangerous or even quite real. But this wolf was real. He could hear it panting. He could see its wet red tongue and its long white teeth. At the sight, a chill crawled all the way from his shoulders to the base of his spine, and gooseflesh tingled on his arms. His heart beat hard in his chest. He told himself he ought to back away carefully. He ought to run. But if I run, he thought, the wolf might chase me. Maybe I should flap my arms and shout so that it goes away. Wild animals are usually nervous of people, aren't they? But the wolf did not look nervous. It looked hungry. Its grey eyes were fixed on Silas, just waiting for him to start running. The narrow path was like a trap with a brick wall on one side and a wire fence on the other. He held his breath. He kept very still, and then the wolf took a step forwards. Silas nearly ran. He nearly cried out in fright and fell over backwards. He did not quite, because he had noticed something. The wolf was walking oddly. It was limping, barely touching the ground with one of its front paws. When it was almost held up the paw as if it wanted to shake hands. Silas knelt down beside the wolf. The paw was larger than both his hands together. It had thick grey fur, hard black claws, and big rough pads. The smell was strong, but not bad. It was earthy and musky, and it reminded Silas of something. For a moment he could not tell what, but then he knew. The wolf smelled like the scent that rises from dry ground at the end of a hot day when the rain begins to fall. He moved the pads apart, and the wolf growled softly in its throat. Silas let go in a hurry, but the wolf whined and offered him the paw again. Being as slow and gentle as he could, he grasped the paw and tried to see what the matter was. Yes, he thought, something was lodged there, a metallic glint deep between the pads. The wolf gave a snarl as he eased the paw open, but it let him coax the object free. It was an old brass drawing pin, battered and bloody. It must have been digging into the paw at every step. The wolf circled away and took a few steps along the path, no longer limping. Then all at once it was alert, lifting its head and swivelling its ears as if it sensed danger. It prowled along the fence until it came to a place where the wire was torn at the bottom, making an entrance into the woodland. The grey eyes locked with Silas's eyes for a moment, and the wolf wriggled through the hole. The patch of woodland had perhaps 20 trees, with the backs of houses showing through the branches. There was nowhere for a large animal to go. But as Silas watched, the wolf crouched in the undergrowth and disappeared from view. Silas stood at the fence, wondering if anything else was trees. It was as if the wolf had never been there. That must be the end, he thought. It had been a brief, strange meeting, and now it was time for him to go home. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Good afternoon," it said. "This is a fortunate meeting." A fox was sitting on the path, a neat creature with a button. It gazed up at him. Beside it sat a second fox, larger and paler, with green eyes set close together. As Silas watched, more foxes appeared on the path, behind the small dark fox and the large pale one. Soon there were 20 foxes sitting and looking at him. The dark fox spoke. "My name is Reynard," he said. And I'll stop there. And as the story develops from that point, what we find is that these are animals that speak, and they exist in a kind of in a sort of a kind of secondary world of a kind, in which animals do speak, and but language is a kind of contention between them, because the foxes are clever and articulate and tricky, and because they are all those things, because language serves them, they control everything, and Reynard the Fox controls everything, and the wolves are the slaves of the foxes, and because the wolves are not good talkers, and so Silas the human is drawn into this a kind of drama of language between the animals who speak, and the book explores that. So, I mean, and I suppose part of what became important to me in writing the book was just that, of course, the idea of animals who speak is, of course, absolutely commonplace staple of fiction for children, but I suppose just the kind of the idea of unpicking and really opening out the kind of the oddity of the idea of animals that speak became important to me, and that to treat it not as a kind of given of the story, but as a kind of question in the story about what does it mean to be an animal who speaks. And I suppose the thing that lies behind that is that human beings, that's what we are. We are the animal who speaks, and in the ways in which that makes us strange in nature, and different from other animals, is part of what I think, to me, the book is about anyway. So is that a good point to
Yes.
go from?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I'll take the cue from your phrase of not being good talkers, because I found that there is somewhat, I feel that the name Silas is much more synonymous to, is actually synonymous with silence, and the boy is ridiculed by his friends and people around for being silent. Mm-hmm. So being drawn to the world of wolves who are not good talkers. And so what inspired you basically to create that world where a 12-year-old Silas gets drawn to this world of the wolves who are just like him, and they sort of help him to articulate? And it's not the foxes, basically, it's the wolves. So what inspired you to create this universe?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, yes, very interesting. I mean, first of all, on the point about the name Silas sounding a bit like silence, it's funny, that had never struck me, but I mean, a few readers kind of asked about that after the book was published, and said, is that a kind of is that a point being made in some way? Or, and it hadn't occurred to me really that it was just a name that I quite like. But of course, it does feel quite fitting in a way that, I suppose it's just an example of how language is sort of treacherous. The little kind of, it's quite like, it's a bit of a silly kind of pun, I suppose, but that is what language does, and the kind of the way in which language generates meanings and sort of tends to become generates labels, is exactly what the book is interested in. So yeah, that feels quite appropriate to me, although I hadn't thought about it in advance. But yes, you were saying that the idea that the wolves, they become a kind of a sort of help to Silas in his trouble with language, and I think that's right. And anyway, I think actually that's really the heart of the matter, and a thought that kind of came to me again, sort of late on in working on the book. Sort of one of the thought, I think, writing a book always ends up, sort of clarifying a few ideas. One you would hope anyway, as you write it. And one idea it clarified for me was about why it is that we like animals. You know, why pets are nice, why animals are kind of easy company for people. And it sort of struck me. Of course, it's because they don't speak. You know, that a relationship with an animal is a relationship that is free of language, and that you can be comfortably silent with an animal, and I think that is probably quite important. You know, that's part of the idea of how Silas and these wolves, you know, the wolves are not creatures that live in language, and therefore it's easy to be with them in silence. I mean, of course, in the book, the wolves, as it turns out, the wolves do speak, and I think that's the sort of I suppose that's the kind of challenge that the book is trying to dramatize, or the sort of technical kind of sleight of hand involved. You know, that I was trying, you know, to certainly to the child reading the book, I wanted to try and offer a kind of idea that, you know, these wolves are kind of, in principle, they are creatures without language, but in terms of what's happening in the story, they have actually been forced into the world of language, and so we're just trying to keep it on a sort of at that kind of point of ambiguity where we're, you know, that and what is kind of helpful and comforting for Silas in relating to the wolves is that they, you know, that they're in this kind of magic space where they both are and are not inside language. Does that make sense?
I think perfectly. It does make sense that way because, like you said, it's very comfortable being around, you know, being silent around the animals. But there is a certain sort of silent care, which is again, you know, the area of my own interest. I have been looking into how care can be, you know, given through silence, or how silence can work as a caring agent. And I think this is what, you know, brings me to the second question about how challenging, because it can be challenging. And, you know, talking about, I mean, I've read Seabiscuit, and the relationship between horse and, you know, a human being, that sort of a friendship, or for that matter, you know, I mean, we all know about the relationship with the regular pet animals like dogs and cats and parakeets, but this is the relationship between a wolf or a pack of wolves and, you know, Silas, and especially Silas caring for the wolves. Is this a sort of, because I could see a sort of, you know, reciprocity of care there involved. You know, the wolves provide the silent care to Silas. And in this case, not just silent care, you know, one of the wolves actually carries Silas on its back and takes him to. So when he's wounded by the foxes. So I was just wondering about the reciprocity of care therein, wherein Silas volunteers to take care of, you know, the cups of her scent. And it's interesting the way you named these, you know, characters. I would not go so far as to call each, you know, animal as animal, because they're sort of, you know, bestowed with beautiful personhood. They have their own agency. So I love that part of it.
Yeah. Oh no, thank you. I'm glad you think so. And by the way, I mean, all the animal names are from medieval beast fable, as I'm sure you know. I mean and that's one, which actually, I mean, in a way that kind of leads me to, I think, an answer to your question. That I mean, but in a slightly roundabout way, if you'll forgive me. So one sort of source of ideas and inspiration for this book was, you know, that there's a cycle of fables, I think mainly French medieval fables, but so I think they've kind of had various forms, about Reynard the Fox, who is a kind of he's a trickster archetype. You know, he's like so many, you know, like Coyote or Anansi or any of these kind of trickster animal archetypes. Reynard is another one. And he has this cycle of stories in which he does the kind of archetypal trickster things of getting himself into trouble and back out again by his kind of his greed and his cleverness, and and his nemesis is Isengrim the wolf, who in those old stories is a bit of a dimwit and always sort of ends up losing, although he's the kind of bigger, stronger creature. And I suppose the sort of, I think, that they're obviously, they're very rich stories, and they and I suppose part the kind of, the impulse to sort of invert that dynamic, or sort of explore it a bit, was again part of what made this book one that I wanted to write, and sort of, let's sort of say, the articulate trickster, let's kind of let's try and be on the wolf side instead, for this story. But sorry, what was my point? I mean, I suppose the thing I think brings that back around to your question, though, is the idea that part of what those kind of beast fables do, I suppose, is they use animals as a way of thinking about human things. That they turn animals into expressions of aspects of human behavior and personality, I suppose. And the idea that the wolf is savage and cunning is savage and a sort of predatory and dangerous is whatever else it may be. It's a story that humans tell about wolves. And equally, the idea that the fox is a cunning trickster is a story that we tell. And so, I mean, what I think is and the way I think the reason that I think that is a thing that I wanted to explore is to do with it, partly supposed to do with the idea of kind of those questions of care that you're talking about, and the way in which the kind of relationship that Silas ends up having with the wolves. I mean, I think because there's, so I'm slightly kind of confusing myself, actually, but I think the point I wanted to make about that was that one of the stories that, I suppose the primary story we tell about wolves is the story of the big bad wolf, but there is also a story about the wolf as a creature that cares for its family, and the wolf pack, the story of, I suppose, in for example, the Jungle Book, Kipling's Jungle Book, story about a child who is brought up by the wolves, and many other stories like that exist, and so that's one way in which we use wolves to talk about ourselves, so that's part of, I think that's part of what happens here. That the kind of Silas, he's kind of incorporated in the wolf pack, incorporated in a kind of like caring set of relationships in that way. To me, the kind of then is, or the sort of the way I hope this book works is by kind of taking that idea and just sort of thinking more, telling a story more about the ways in which that also is a kind of that's a sort of story. And I think that that there's, I'm interested in the way in which we can sort of use the animals that we tell stories about to think about, for example, relationships of care, but also sort of always be just conscious of the fact that it's a story we're telling, and we can always be asking, is that what's happening for the animals themselves, or is it, are we saying something here about the kind of non-human reality that exists there, or are we saying, or are we kind of writing over that with a kind of human story, or are both things happening at once? I don't know. That I become increasingly preoccupied with that question as I work on these stories. But yes, I'll leave that answer there before I confuse myself even further.
I guess you made your point perfectly well. I think, yes, the story has the warps and the depths of battles that I see, And at a perfunctory glance, one would see that this is a battle that sort of creates tension between the pack of foxes and the pack of wolves.
Yeah.
But then over a period of time, after reading a couple of chapters, you realize, oops, that's not just the case. There's a legacy that's passed on. There's also a relationship of, obligation there.
Right.
So yes, I can totally understand, why this aspect of care, right from that, from the first go that exists, silent care. I could see a spectrum of nuances of care there.
Right.
So while you was, even right now when you were talking about it, I could, sort of see that entire novel right in front of me. I was just thinking about the kind of challenges you faced as a writer, or if there were any, in drafting such a wonderful novel about how, the very idea that a human character decides to volunteer to care for the, wolf, and wolf is the kind of image that we have in our heads, but the wolf is more of, a scary animal that will attack, more of a predator. So what kind of, thoughts were there in your head as a writer when you see that sort of relationship between, the human character Silas and Isengrim and her scent?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, again, I think it's really central to what, certainly what the book would like to be doing. I mean, I don't know what you think. I mean, I think it's, part of what makes wolves interesting to me is that they do have, it appears to me that humans do have a kind of particularly contradictory relationship with that species. That, of course, as we know, and there's of course a history to this, that I'm not meaning to imply at all that this is all a kind of just web of pure fictions. I mean, there is a history to the relationship between these species, in which that wolves have have been threatening to humans at certain points. Equally, humans have done great harm to wolves as a species, along with many other species. And I think that's something I didn't sort of know a lot about in detail when I started writing the book. But of course, it's the kind of thing that you find you feel a kind of a sort of responsibility to sort of try and know about as you work on a story like this. It's, I don't know. I'm. It's fascinating, I think, because it's all, when you choose for example, a topic like the wolf to write about, it's hard to kind of keep perspective on it, and it starts to loom large in your own imagination. But it seems to me that there is something about humans and wolves specifically that is a kind of odd double-edged relationship that I think we kind of identify with them quite strongly, but also historically fear them quite deeply. Here in Ireland, where I am, wolves have been extinct for a long time. It was, but they lived in Ireland for many thousands of years, and as far as I've been able to determine, the last wolves in Ireland died out around 1780 something, and they were exterminated as part of the process of human beings occupying, sort of spreading themselves across the country, and yet in Irish storytelling, as in a lot of other traditions of storytelling, the wolf has quite an important part. The wolf here was known as, it was called Mac Tír, which means the son of the land, and there's a kind of, which to me sort of suggests an idea that the wolf kind of belongs to the land in a way that we perhaps don't entirely, that the wolf kind of has a prior claim to be here. And the stories about being raised by wolves, being able to speak to wolves, they keep coming up in mythologies. So I suppose what I'm saying, I suppose, is that this particular story about a kind of a human in a relationship with wolves, in a kind of care, a relationship of care and kind of mutual understanding with wolves, is, I think, part of a very kind of deep rooted way of thinking about animals, and specifically about wolves. And I mean, my own theory, for what it's worth, is that the reason if there is a kind of particular substance to the human wolf relationship, it is of course because, you know, that they are quite like us in some ways, and you know that we were competitors in quite a direct human, and therefore we needed narratives by why they had to be extinct, but also to kind of, and you know, in the sort of perverse way of human beings, that also involves a kind of intimacy, a kind of identification with the creature that you are competing with. So I think that's why that relationship to me is fascinating. That you know, it's one that's are you know, setting up, and you know, writing a story like this in the 21st century, I think obviously because for all those reasons, it then becomes a story about how we imagine our relationship with I almost say the natural world, but I think a better word is the non-human world, because to talk about the natural world is to duality, you know, in which we are not part of the natural world. Yeah, I don't know. Does that speak to your question?
Yes, that does. I mean, human and non-human relationship to human, and I just like to read an fragment from the novel. This is something that I found impactful in the novel itself, apart from, you know, of course, this is one of the fragments among many others. But for the present conversation, I want to know what, you know, inspired it to draft this. So, when the forest was young, the foxes gave language to the wolves. The wolves learned to name the forests around us, rock and tree. So I was just wondering about the way wolves bequeath language from the foxes. And it's the foxes who are more articulate, and the wolves learn the language from them. From foxes to the wolves, and then from wolves to Silas. It's kind of, you know, a different, you know, chain, or maybe a legacy. The transfer of language is a legacy. So here you see a different kind of legacy, linguistic legacy here. So I was just wondering about, you know, what you felt as a writer to shape this kind of linguistic legacy in your novel.
Yeah. Yes, so I mean, so that whole idea about sort of language passing from creature to creature, in a way, yeah. And this is like the little kind of mini mythology invents, I suppose, for these characters, and the identity as the clever, tricky animal. They are the ones who have language most at their kind of disposal, and they then teach language to the wolves, and that's what kind of enslaves the wolves. And as that mythology kind of gets filled in a bit more, we sort of that the foxes themselves are understood to have to have acquired language from the human beings. So I mean, so I guess this is my way of kind of involving the animal characters in the kind of web of language, and sort of trying to sort of again explore that kind of that structure of ideas, because, you know, I mean, I suppose that if it's sort of, I don't know if this is fair to say, but it seems to me, you know, if you look at kind of the, you know, your sort of the kind of talking animal narratives that we might be familiar with from our maybe reading as children, you know, and so everyone will have different ones. So for example, I don't know, like Wind in the Willows, for example, was always an important book for me, and the animals just speak. That it's just a given. They speak as humans speak, and they are humans in most ways that matter. And so this kind of sort of making a myth about language acquisition into part of the story was again part of my way of trying to kind of open that out a bit and think about what it means to be given language. That is. I suppose part of what again I learned from trying to do that was that it was also partly, I suppose, talking about consciousness and how we think about being conscious. I think there's, and maybe this is just, I suppose maybe these are my own kind of assumptions emerging, but I said one of the things I learned from writing this book was that I do, for better or worse, I think I probably do make an assumption that there's quite a close link between language and consciousness, and that really, with this story about the wolves learning language from the foxes is really a story about wolves becoming conscious in a kind of human style. That sort of naming, the wolves learn to name the forest around us, rock and tree, pack and prey. That's what humans do in Genesis, in Garden of Eden, isn't it? And it's and I suppose it's what one way of reading that myth is about a kind of beginning of consciousness, a kind of fall from a kind of from an innocent state of existing merely into a kind of state of self-consciousness and consciousness of one's kind of otherness, separate from the world around us. So I guess that was what that sort of meant to me. That the idea that these animal characters, the foxes, the wolves, they both learn language, and in doing so they've become that they no longer simply exist in the kind of weave of the real. They exist instead inside narratives of themselves, which is the predicament that we are in. And I suppose the sort of, again, the kind of conceit of the story is just to drag the animal characters into that as well, and kind of force them to act out the human preoccupations, which is what we always do when we talk about animals. Repeating myself, this is what we do by talking about animals. We rope them into acting out human ideas, and again, that kind of mythology of language is quite kind of deliberately doing that, and sort of, but trying to sort of make us aware that we're doing it at the same time, and again, that which again sort of felt important to me. Just as a sort of sidebar to add to that as well. I read in the course of writing this book, one of the books I read was a book by David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth, which is a very distressing book about kind of likely prediction and projections for the coming decades under the effects of climate collapse. But in that book he makes a few kind of, I think, quite important kind of points about just actually how pervasive in our thinking it tends to be to kind of treat the natural world as a sort of allegories, and a sort of again, I say natural, non-human is better, to treat the non-human world as a source of allegories for the things that matter to us, which seems very obvious and kind of simple in a way. My first reaction to hearing that is to sort of think, well, yes, of course we do that a bit, but of course we also know that it's that there's a world out there beyond our narratives. But it's just, I don't know, in a serious sort of quite alarming book like that, I just find it very interesting to see a writer who has thought a lot about this, suggesting that just that habit of treating the world beyond us as essentially a sort of storehouse of allegory or metaphor for things that we think are important. Just how kind of decisively dangerous that can be to us. But anyway, that's a slight sidebar. Yeah.
I think the very point of danger aside brings me to my next question about the dangerous pact. I mean, this is what I found interesting about the pact between deer and the wolves, that, you know, they sort of were submitting themselves, offering themselves as gift to the wolves. So the hunting of the deer was not an act, of course. In a regular scheme of things, we are taught that this is the food chain. But here the novel says that, you know, the deer voluntarily offers itself to the wolves.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of a gift, that I am gifting my body so that you can consume me. So I found this fact sort of interesting. Would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you found that interesting. It's just a moment in the book where the wolf characters talk about what it's like to hunt deer, and yeah, so they sort of they present this picture of it, which is sort of counterintuitive to Silas the human, in which the deer, yeah, as you say, the deer is almost more in control of the hunt than the wolves are, or, you know, they sort of say that we didn't choose the deer to kill, the deer chose us for its death, and they talk about how there's a kind of communication, I suppose, is the important idea, that between the hunting pack and the deer herd, there's a kind of communication that happens, and there's a sort of you know, it's not like, well, you know, it's hard. Almost the thought that comes by you, it's not like a kind of an army invading a country, you know, or something like that. It's a different process, and whereas, you know, a pack of wolves hunting a kind of a herd of innocent creatures, you know, might be a metaphor that we might use as humans for a big country invading a small neighbor, and I suppose the point that the wolf on that page of the book is making is just that's not it. It's not that human story, and she says, you know, you can't really understand this as a human being, because, you know, humans think of things in terms of winners and losers, zero sum games. That you know, if someone wins the hunt, then someone else has lost it. Someone is the predator, that someone else is the victim. And I suppose her kind of the wolf's point is just that those are human categories of thought, and for what's happening when a wolf hunts a deer may not be that at all, actually. Now that to say that, of course, is itself also a kind of tendentious narrative, and we can't really get outside that, I suppose. I mean, in researching this, reading about how wolves do hunt, I mean, that sort of moment in the book just came from the fact that I did find that fascinating to read about, and there's, you know, a few kind of descriptions by naturalists of what does happen when a wolf hunts were just very, very interesting and enlightening to me, because you know, as to the best of my understanding, you know, there is some element of communication like that, and there is a sort of, there's a kind of odd, almost cooperative element. But, you know, to be honest, you know, I am, you know, I'm no expert, and I am very aware that the way I tell it in the book is inevitably also a kind of a story that I have made up. And I was just so I mean, what I hope kind of comes out of the reading the book, again, certainly for a child who's reading, is just a sort of a sense of unsettlement of these ways of thinking about things, that, you know, that here is another way you might tell that story, and that there's, you know, I think trying to imagine, again, I mean, you sort of, it kind of brings you up against a real mystery, doesn't it? You know, the sort of question of what's actually happening for the deer, or what's actually happening for the wolf, I think is genuinely mysterious. And as a human trying to kind of enter that kind of imaginative space, there's a sort of double discipline, you know, to not anthropomorphize in a kind of cheap way, but also not to fail to anthropomorphize in an appropriate way. You know, that there's a long history, of course, of humans discounting the suffering of animals, which is a kind of, a sort of a history of terrible atrocity that is kind of largely still shadowed, actually. But in this case, I mean that was the set of ideas that really interested me about that, and I agree. It was one of the it's sort of it was a moment in the book where I thought that's really rich, and I kind of would love to go into that more, but I don't know if I've quite learned how to yet. I think there might be a whole other book that needs to be written about that, actually. And I think it seems to me that's you find those moments occasionally in writing one book where you think that's a whole other thing that I'd love to explore, but if I start to go into it now, the book will not go to the place that this book is going to. But maybe I think there's a lot more thinking to be done about that. So on the one hand, the kind of the genuine mystery of kind of what's going on in those minds, those forms of sentience, and then the sort of just the awareness that the story we might tell, the kind of allegory we might draw from the hunt and the kill is our story, not theirs.
I think I really would love to know about this fact if you were to ever write the story, because you really don't get to hear the voice of the deer. Mm-hmm. So you hear the hunters, but you do not see the voice. You do not hear the voice of how it feels to be hunted. Yeah. So I think I'd really like to see if at all in future you plan to write about the pact between the two. So yes, definitely. But I mean, that of course talks about breaking the silence, and this, entire work of yours, this entire novel is more about the politics of silence. Who breaks the silence? Who stays silent? Why? And I think the next question is more about, the learning, being comfortable in silence of one another, learning silence as a form of language, most importantly. Mm. And at this point, I'd like to read out, another passage from the novel that I found really interesting. And here it goes. The wolves lived in silence, and when they saw the child, they knew him. He was a wolf-stung child. He knew what it was to live in silence, and this meant he could speak for the wolves. Words had hurt the wolves, trapped them in the prison, and put them to death. And so they asked the child for his help. They asked him to speak his words for them. End quote. So I was just wondering about this beautiful idea, words being violent, but silence being a comfort zone, and how, somehow humans have always had this agency I believe that I can speak for the other animals, but here the animals have chosen that, you are the wolf-stung child. You can understand our words and our silence, and therefore, it's fine between. So there's a sort of, indirect pact that I see between Silas and the wolves, as in Grimm and Hersent, that it's fine if you speak for us. Somehow we can see that you're not a flat human character that speaks a human language. You understand us, and this wolf's tongue, which is part silence and part the language bequeathed from the foxes. So maybe you'll be able to put our words that we aren't able to, employ them the way we want. So I wanted to know more about that.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the way you described it there is absolutely right. And I mean, that's, again, I suppose that's the sort of, in as much as the book kind of makes up its own little mini mythology, I think that's obviously what it comes round to, the sort of the idea that, there's a certain type of human agent who is called the Wolfstongue in this story, who in a kind of, in the sort of slightly paradoxical way, speaks on behalf of silent things, or speaks for the silent thing, that they can be articulated without breaking their silence, and so I suppose that's the kind of the figure that the story is about in the end, and the idea is that Silas becomes this figure who again is sort of is sort of balanced in quite a kind of precarious way between the worlds of speech and silence, I suppose. It's again, which was just a kind of an idea which again just became important, I think, in the book as I was working on it, and it sort of emerged for me why it seemed like quite an important idea, because it's I mean, it's sort of to I suppose to kind of invoke all those kind of big questions about how human beings relate to the world that is not human, which just become more and more pressing. There's a sort of like inescapable bind, isn't there? In that, if we sort of take it that, that we can't really evade the fact or escape the fact that we are as human beings, we live inside language, and we don't only live inside language, but predominantly are sort of as I mean, but again, just sort of to interject, what I think another book that I was reading at the time of writing this book was I was reading Yuval Noah Harari's blockbusters, Sapiens and Homo Deus, and which present this particular view of the power of human culture as the sort of the thing, and as I understand it, in his account, the thing that has made humans quite so successful and quite so destructive is I suppose what you as you might as a shorthand describe as culture. The ability to narrativize our activities and to involve large numbers of people in kind of coordinated activity through essentially narrative, or you might call it myth, or you might call it culture, whatever you want to call it. But kind of certainly kind of language in the broader sense of kind of shared systems of signification for Harari is the thing that kind of that has led to so much trouble in terms of how humans have existed on this planet. And that's that I suppose is the kind of idea that underlies this in a way, that we can't get out of that bind, that however much we might want to kind of give other modes of being their due, other sort of non-human forms of non-human life their due, either they remain mute or we speak on their behalf. And I suppose that and either way, that's a human thing to do. And so I suppose the kind of the element of fantasy, and the reason this has to be a kind of fantasy story really is a fantasy about a little kind of tiny magic space in which that bind might be resolved. That there might be a way to kind of speak without breaking the silence. Is the kind of is the sort of the sort of briefest way to put it, I suppose. That and that's what this kind of the magic figure of the wolf speaking, the wolf tongue human is supposed to be, I suppose. Again, I mean, it is sort of self-evidently kind of a logical impossibility, but in terms of fantasy, that's a kind of imaginative space that we can kind of posit, and once you've sort of posited it, you can start to think about what it would be like to exist there. Is the point, I suppose.
I think, I mean, feel free to not answer the last question because it's more about the sequel, because I could see, as a reader, I could see that this is a trilogy in making, and I don't know what the next sequel could come, but I could see the last part of it, in my own head as a reader, that if I were to sort of bring the last part of the trilogy to Wolfstongue, I would bring Silas back to the forest, more like an old blind man, more acting as Tiresias, who's known the past, has lived the present, and is now the old man trying to sort of act as a mediator between the foxes and the wolves.
Yeah.
And I mean, the way I could see it, and maybe, Silas writing it down at the end, on each tree, the narratives of the wolves for the others. So the Wolfstongue, begins with a speech, but ends with the not just the violence, but the materiality of the script.
Right.
So
yeah.
I was more thinking along the lines of script of Wolfstongue, you know, in the trilogy, the last part, about how Wolfstongue could be shaped more as a script, the written script, and, you know, the figure of Silas, more like a Tiresias figure, can, you know, talk about the future, that if you don't sort this, you know, battle out between the two of you, where this could lead to. So I was thinking more about that.
No, I mean that's very very interesting, and I mean I hope I get to write it as a trilogy. I was saying to you before we began that I am working on a second book, which is sort of quite close to being done. I hope now, and it's interesting you say about Silas aging up, because that is something I've done in this. He's in the second book he's middle aged, and the child figure is his daughter. And which maybe does show. I mean, maybe there's sort of, you know, part of this. What's important in this whole set of ideas too is about thinking forward into the future. Actually, that these kind of questions are actually questions about, you know, almost more about kind of our relationship with the future than with which we currently find ourselves. But yeah, I would love that. I hope. I suppose these things are never certain, but I hope I get a chance to write the third one where maybe Silas would be a kind of a Tiresias and sort of speaking from the other end of the lifespan. No, fascinating. I would also just, I mean, one thing I think I sort of forgot to really mention was that, I mean, the other thing about the idea of a kind of character or a sort of figure who can speak in this odd way, or can occupy that kind of odd, slightly impossible relationship with language and silence. Just, I mean, it's that. I mean, that was what I mean. The place the story started from was about a kind of an intuition. There was some kind of link between speech difficulty and animals as sort of silent beings, and I suppose in a way that the simplest form of that is the idea that we talked about of animals as kind of comfortable companion, or sort of easy companions with whom you can have a relationship that is not caged by language. But then I suppose the place that develops to the other end of that thought process is about the idea of, you know, those who have, and everyone has to some degree, had to struggle with language as a human being. Felt not entirely at home in language, because I think it's probably, I don't know, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think part of what language does is make you not feel quite at home with yourself. That, you know, that language is necessarily a struggle, because precisely because it kind of engages us with what is beyond ourselves as an individual. You know, engages you with kind of with the wider human world, which is difficult, and so I suppose part of the kind of allegiance that the book has, of course, is to children who struggle with language, and part of the kind of point, or the idea expressed, is that, you know, that's a kind of there's a kind of special potential in that, you know, that not having found language easy is actually quite a valuable trait, because it puts us in this kind of more self-aware relation with the difficulties of language. So yeah, just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you so much, Sam. I mean, I hope to, you know, continue this interaction even in future, about not just about Wolfstongue, about your other novels, and of course about Jott, because it's part of my thesis. So yes, I will be in touch with you all the while, but I guess Professor Chattopadhyay had some questions about Jott, so over to him.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Thanks.
Hi, that was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having this. I mean, before I jump into Jott, maybe I was just thinking about the conversation you're having, and especially this whole kind of, let's say, problematization of this anthropological difference between the human animal and the non-human animal. And I was wondering, when you mentioned, I mean, I was just thinking about that novella, or maybe it's actually a short story more than a novella, that Laszlo Krasznahorkai wrote, The Last Wolf. which is a
Right.
strange kind of an inwording of that entire problem of extinction of wolves and the last wolf, the mythical last wolf, as it were. And but
I haven't
coming,
read that, so I must seek that out. Thank you.
yeah, that's a wonderful novel. I think, I mean, it's a novella, more of a, or maybe an extended short story. It doesn't go for more than 50 pages or so, and it's very tangentially about the animal, I must say. But it's about this sort of myth of the last wolf, or the extinction of the species, as it were. Uh, but I was also thinking about whether, to a certain extent, while writing this novel, you had some sort of a subversion of the Kipling model in mind. I mean, as we know, it has been variously criticized as a colonialist narrative model, and whether this sort of, because there, again, I mean, as someone who hasn't read this book, with due apologies, this could be a completely stupid question, but I'm just thinking, this idea of a wolf's tongue and a human being invested with an animal language, in that sense, is a reversal of the sort of Kipling situation, where we have a certain, I mean, yes, there is an assumption of animalization of the human in Kipling, but then, that's what leads to rejection. Here, if I understood correctly, this is a site of agency in your novel, this particular wolf's tongue that is, perhaps gifted to the human, as it were. So that's just one observation I wanted to make. But generally, because of course it's a medical humanities series, I was wondering whether, as a writer, when you were thinking about this novel, thinking about the problem of speech disturbance, were you thinking of it in some sort of a medical context? I mean, aphasia, way back, Freud wrote an essay in his sort of very early psychological period, before he invented something like psychoanalysis, on aphasia. And then, of course, I mean, linguists later on came to talk about aphasia, Jacobson and others. Jacques Lacan picked it up from there, and again kind of brought it into the scope of psychoanalysis, because the Freud text on aphasia is not very, obviously read alongside psychoanalysis, because it's one of those pre-psychoanalytic metapsychological works. But generally, I was also reminded of this very cryptic but very interesting play by Peter Handke called Casper, which is again about a little child without the presence of the non-human animal. It's about this little child, Caspar Hauser, and there was a real life person like that, who had sort of, again, I can't remember the exact details, but who had sort of grown up without a language because he was abandoned as a kid. And he was in some hole, literally, and he was found as a 17-year-old with just one sentence that he could string together. So we had a full-blown adult without language, as it were. So I was thinking about that play. I mean, that goes way back. I think Handke's play must have been in the 60s or 70s. I was wondering whether there's some sort of a shadow of these questions, especially the sort of biomedical angle on aphasia or speech disturbance. And because, again, I mean, to medicalize that question is also an ethical choice that the writer somewhere has to make, if at all, right? Because it's ethically complicated, that choice to medicalize speech disturbance, right? And I was wondering whether you deliberately chose not to, because we were not talking about that in this conversation. But again, I could be wrong because I never read the novel. I'm really sorry about that. I will. I mean, that's something for the future.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, no, I mean, so much to think about there. And I mean, I think, I mean, on the point about Kipling, I absolutely agree. I think that it's, I mean, again, I sort of can only speak from what I hope this book does, but I mean, I think, I would certainly want any kind of fiction to be, in a kind of a sort of some kind of engagement and conversation with ideology, and I mean, to sort of to think about, to be thinking about the way that storytelling, the kind of ideologies that storytelling encodes, and so I would certainly want this book to be about those questions. And I mean, and the Jungle Book is absolutely a kind of a sort of, I mean, it's not something that this is directly kind of speaking to, but it's quite closely indirectly speaking to it. I think that it's certainly something I would want to be kind of to feel there was a kind of conversation going on there with the way in which the kind of the ideology of the Jungle Book plays out in that story. and I mean, it's fascinating. For whatever reason, the kind of the moment in the Jungle Book that always has stuck with me above all was the kind of the bit where we learn that the animals can't hold the human's gaze. That there's a moment, I think, where Bagheera is sort of teaching Mowgli about why why all the animals are afraid of the humans, and they say he says look into my eyes, and then he looks away and says no, none of us can hold your gaze. And I mean, I'm still slightly I'm still not sure if I fully know what that moment means, but it seems there's something quite troubling about it, I think. And so yeah, I don't know, again, that's sort of but the kind of idea about the relationship between the human and the animal that implies, I think I hope there's a conversation that happened that this kind of book is involved in about that. I mean, as far as the question about medicalizing speech difficulty, I mean, you're right. I was a bit cautious about that for a couple of reasons. I think partly because I'm not medical, and I sort of wouldn't want to kind of sort of claim to sort of be presenting a kind of a more reliable picture than but I mean, so really what I did was write from my own experience that in my own family we've had my son had some speech troubles, and sort of in retrospect, him having those troubles, I could look back at my own experience as quite a small child and think, oh yeah, I probably had those kind of troubles as well, actually. And so I was sort of my sort of starting point was to write from immediate experience, and sort of not to kind of worry too much about kind of going sort of diagnostically beyond that. I know that a couple of readers, I think, have said, oh, I thought the character of Silas had a form of selective mutism, for example, and that that might be the case, but in a way I felt it served the purposes of the book to kind of certainly try to be kind of accurate in the representation of what it was like, but not to sort of I didn't think it was particularly relevant to the purposes of the book to sort of say this is the thing he has, or this is the kind of it's just to me it's much more about and also that I don't, in some I don't know, it's to sort of speak from the subjective experience of it more than anything else, I think, which I don't know. I mean, does that make sense? Is that? Yeah.
No, it does. I mean, in fact, that's what I was saying. I mean, it's always a tricky thing, right? I mean, how do we medicalize something without pathologizing it in a narrative?
Yeah.
I mean, and diagnostic categories are often in medical humanities discussions. This is something that we often talk about, right? In clinical communication, a very direct diagnostic moment can be extremely confrontational for the person on the other side of the table. I mean, the person who's not the doctor, let's say, you are this is like a pinning down, and that's all often a moment of violence, wittingly or unwittingly, right? And
again, I mean, thinking about this as I wrote the book again, I sort of think, of course, this is exactly what this is about as well. And I mean, sort of thinking in terms of, I suppose, in terms of kind of neurodiversity has been my own sort of most immediate experience of thinking about these things. That Silas is, in some sense, he's a kind of neurodivergent character. I think, and part of the kind of subjective experience that the book is trying to represent is about what that's like for him, and to the kind of gifts and challenges that involves for him. And I mean, of course, it seems to me this is exactly the point, that of course, to be sort of diagnosed or identified or as, say, for example, neurodivergent is a kind of there's something that's, as you say, that there could be a sort of experience that as quite a sort of violent thing. It can also be a very helpful thing, of course, to people, that that sort of to be able to sort of and to have a kind of vocabulary for what is going on. It, as we all know, that of course that's potentially actually very helpful and kind of freeing in certain ways.
Right.
But I think both those things are true, and so I sort of hope that that's something. I mean, although the book doesn't kind of go into those kind of questions of like what is, how do we diagnose silos, if at all, that's not a thing that the book goes into directly. But of course, the kind of question of what it means to kind of to label, sort of to sort of say the wolf is the big bad wolf and the fox is the cunning fox. It's kind of the same issue for me. So I suppose it's a way of talking about those questions.
Right. I mean, I don't want to take more time, but if others don't have a question, I might have a question about Jott at the end, but I'd like to perhaps, see if there are questions from the floor. Anyone? You could just, let me just check one thing. Yes, you can unmute yourself and speak, or you could put it in the chat box if you have a question for Sam. Questions, comments, please, if there are any.
We may have tired everybody out at this stage.
With the wolf's tongue, with not the human tongue, the wolf's tongue. Is there a question? I mean, from the audience?
I just have a quick comment to.
Go ahead, Swati.
I mean, while the two of you were discussing, I just figured out how Temple Granton's, relationship with the cows, and she's an American animal behaviorist, and I've been following her work for a while, and the kind of relationship that she had with the cows helped her become an animal behaviorist, of course, but also it helped her to cope up with her own autistic condition. She could understand the world better in mathematical, when she applied this mathematical lens, so she could see the world better with maths. And I think this is also true with the kind of tongues that, human beings usually borrow from the non-human livings around them. And that's how they figure out their own language to articulate, to communicate. It might not be the human language that, that we learn. It's not always the human language that we learn is helpful. We're always lacking. I mean, there's always the dearth of words to express, but somehow the borrowed languages, turn into a sort of a bricolage. That's what I was thinking.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Yes, I mean, and it is something that I've been aware of in writing and talking about this. That I mean, one way in which I think this whole argument, could and should be expanded is into the kind of awareness that I mean, it's a little, there's a potential kind of to be misleading in sort of saying human language belongs to humans, because of course it's not that simple, that communication systems of meaning exist for other creatures too, and I mean that's so yeah, there's a kind of simplification that we have to watch out for, I guess. Yeah.
Any other questions from audience members in human language?
Yeah.
Even though there is an animal language, maybe there's no speech as such, but we could have some speech here if anyone is interested in unmuting themselves. Okay, maybe I would very quickly ask the Jott question that I wanted to ask, and it's right here. So since I carried the book, I might as well show it. So this is just a very simple, basic, contextual question I have, not so much about the medical representation and the representation of the hospitals in the book, but of course I would like to know a little bit perhaps about the kind of research you did to actually find out about these hospitals in their own time. Yeah. But I was just generally wondering about the very fact that this book goes back to, and of course I'm speaking here as someone who's been working on Beckett for a number of years now. Yeah. So I was just kind of wondering if you could take us through the motivation for writing something like an alternative literary history of published texts and a certain friendship that has been documented from a very particular perspective by a writer. And for those who are unaware of this, Geoffrey Thompson, who was Beckett's friend, if I'm not mistaken, happens to be Sam Thompson's grandfather. And that was a friendship which Beckett wrote about in a certain symbolic, allegorical fashion in Murphy, his novel. And in a way, Jott is like a, I don't know if that's the word, if you would agree with that, is like a counterblast to Murphy, as it were, or some sort of a response, a critical response to Murphy.
Yeah.
Maybe. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to these two questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this takes me back because I haven't talked about Jott for absolutely ages. So let me try and piece some thoughts together. I think that's absolutely right. The way you described it, it seems absolutely true to me. I think, I mean, also a kind of a love letter and a kind of letter of appreciation to Murphy, which is one of my favourite novels. I think I love Murphy, and just. I mean, the sort of I happen to have that sort of that family connection with this with the kind of model. I mean, it's not a book. It's a book about a kind of fictionalized counterpart of a character of Samuel Beckett, he's not called Samuel Beckett. He's not exactly Samuel Beckett, but he's a kind of figure who resembles him, and just he's. I mean, to me, it really it seems kind of. That family connection is neither here nor there, I think, as far as I'm concerned anyway. Although, of course, it was part of what kind of got me interested in that particular story. But yes, I mean, I mean, Murphy to me is just a fascinating novel because it's, I mean, quite apart from how brilliant and funny it is. It's also, I mean, and the way that it shows you Beckett kind of, I think, working out some ideas that were just going to be important throughout the rest of his writing life. I mean, in particular terms of the way he's thinking about the difference between what it means to be mad and what it means to be sane, and the way in which mad people are. That there's a sort of, I don't know if it's quite accurate to sort of say it kind of foreshadows the anti-psychiatric movement, but it certainly seemed to me that there's a lot of that in there, that ideas that kind of became more current in the 60s already in Murphy several decades earlier, Beckett is actually kind of thinking through and sort of putting into question ideas about what it is to be mad and what it is to be sane, and that has just always fascinated me, and the way in which this book is a sort of, again, either counterblast or kind of warm response to Murphy, is to just sort of think, that I mean, I'm very interested by the kind of the very kind of demanding, almost messianic kind of stance that Beckett is able to take up, as in his work, and I think probably in his life as well. He's quite an extreme person, quite sort of quite a kind of a person who did not compromise, and the ideas about, I mean, the ideas about sanity that are in Murphy are very uncompromising. That he takes the idea that really what it is to be sane and what it is to be mad. That the kind of the received understanding to be sane is better than to be mad is one that he just rejects completely in Murphy, as far as I can see. And Murphy himself is a character who wishes that he was psychotic, and he envies Mr. Enden, who lives in a kind of entirely detached reality. And that's a very kind of exacting and extreme position to take. Although, I mean, absolutely self-consistent, I think. And you can admire it, but I suppose the point of this book is to write a kind of explore the same set of ideas and almost the same settings from the point of view of a character who is not so extreme, and who, like most of us, kind of is not able to reject everything about cultural convention, but has to kind of live inside it. And and so this was the character who is himself a psychiatrist and is so kind of is therefore kind of involved in you know, it being that we ought to cure people who are mad, and that they are suffering, and that they would be better if they were not suffering in that way. So you know, all that I think that's sort of as fair a summary as I can make of the kind of the ideas that are at work in the book. And so I think I'm glad that you say that it's a kind of counterpart to Murphy, because that's certainly what I would love it to be. You know, is a book that kind of exists in the background of Murphy and kind of, or just explores the same places. In terms of finding out about the sort of practices of psychiatric care at that time, it was quite difficult actually. I mean, there's a lot of there are very, very rich, dense histories of the Bethlehem hospital, and took what I could on them. But in doing so, I thought it was fascinating actually to find out to do that with the aim of then writing about that place in the 1930s means that I ended up kind of keeping on finding that there were just things I couldn't find out. You know, that even in the very, very comprehensive histories of the Bethlehem, you sort of, because as you write fiction, you come up with very concrete questions like what kind of room was this? Or, you know, what did they actually do? What was the daily routine? What was the what sort of were the practices? Often I just couldn't find out. You know, it seemed to me that and maybe, you know, that may be my failings as a researcher, but also I felt like it was a lesson to me in just how these things just get lost as well. You know, that there are some things that even, you know, a kind of institution like that, which does have quite a kind of well documented history, there's if when you try to sort of work your way back into the texture of actually being there, you know, you do reach these points where you just have to say, I just have to kind of imagine it, or I have to make my best guess from what we do seem to know. So yeah, no, that was fascinating to me actually.
Thank you so much. I think, I mean, if we have a last question, we could take it. Otherwise, you know, I will give it over to Swati to thank you. But thank you so much from my end too, Sam. It was wonderful to hear from you. I do hope to continue the conversation in other forms, because I do have other things that I would want to ask you about Jott especially, but I need to reread the novel, to be honest. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and you know, thank you so much for having me, because it's a real privilege to get to come and, you know, have such a kind of rich and you know, well thought through conversation about it. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sam, for agreeing to, you know, spare some time and most importantly have this beautiful conversation. I mean, I had always planned this event in my head, but to see it materialize today, I'm really happy about it. Thank you so much. And I'll stay in touch with you as well. So
yeah. Great. Yeah. No, thank you. A real pleasure. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Good to speak to you.
Thank you everyone for joining. Bye. Thank you, Sam. Bye.